Centipede begins its descent into arcades. Analysts predict a big future for video games. And the BBC chooses Acorn over Sinclair. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the podcast where we travel back in time to see what was making headlines in the video game and computer industry 40, 30, and 20 years ago. I'm your host, Carl, and as always, here with my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. So, banter time.
Banter time. Oh, can't complain. I mean, I'm not always here, as our dear listeners surely noticed last episode. So, but I like you to stick with that. So,
yeah,
make me feel like part of the game.
You're always here in our hearts, even when John is coming in to do a great job. Filling in for you. So,
all good.
Yeah, dude. Scheduling has been a pain, but.
Exactly.
We're almost both vaccinated. Soon we're going to be able to do this in the same room again.
Well, we are both vaccinated, aren't we? We are just not immune yet, or not
well,
be considered immune. You
not
are?
You. Yeah, I got the Johnson & Johnson. My 2 weeks are up.
Oh, your 2 weeks are up. Wonderful. My 2 weeks end tomorrow, so starting tomorrow, it's party time.
Well, it's going to be a few more weeks. I've got to get through this semester. I'm still teaching classes at night, but as soon as that is done, I had to move everything to the night time. Yeah, parental responsibilities during the day. I'm teaching from 6 to 9:30 every night. So
okay, and your students love you because this is the time they usually get out of bed?
Sort of, except the ones on Fridays. They have expressed a few minor consternations with this, but they got over it pretty quickly. They love me, I think. Well, I'll find out when the evaluation forms come back at the end of the semester. But,
this idiot of a teacher teaches always at night.
Yeah. Oh, well. Okay. Hey, we got a ton of stories today, and we also have our 7 minutes in heaven. But first, remember, everybody, if you want to help support us, help us, pay for the bills and whatnot, we have a Patreon where you're going to get early access to interviews. We've got 3 really good ones up there right now. Jim Trucano, former AMOA president, Kevin Hayes, former head of Atari, not head of, but former Atari Ireland guy and Namco arcade guy. And Gary Carlson, half of the Carlson brothers that originally founded Bruderbund. So those 3 interviews are still up exclusively. Last week we posted the first part of my 2-part interview with Gordon Walton, who's a pioneer both in game programming, but also a pioneer of the online space. And he's got a new game coming out next month. It's finally launching Crowfall. Really awesome looking game. Unfortunately, my 7-year-old hardware kind of had to take me trying to run it, but it gives some awesome insights into how big companies worked. He was at EA in the Ultima Online days. He worked on Star Wars Galaxies and Star Wars Old Republic and a bunch of other stuff. Great stories. Second part is coming out in July. So check that out. And I believe that's it for the plugs. Social medias and stuff. All the links are in the show notes, people.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, and you can become a Patreon member and get all the benefits for as low as $1 a month. Really, we just kind of like to have the numbers. So come on, give us $1. That's it. And also remember that all of our news that we talk about here, when we go back, we're always using the publication dates on publications, the links to the publications, and the references are also in the show notes. So yes, of course, the events always happen a little bit before that. But before we do the jumping, we have to dive deep into one of the games that was reviewed in our Jump this month, 40 years back in June of 1981. And yes, I'm slowly losing it in my head. June of 1981. And so Peter's going to spend 7 minutes in heaven playing Zork 1 on the Apple II.
Welcome back, Peter. So, how were your 7 minutes in heaven with Zork? Well, first, let's start off basic. What is Zork, according to your 7-minute experience?
Confusing. According to my 7-something minutes experience, Zork is a text-based story adventure game. You're starting in front of a house, in front of a mailbox, and then you're basically free to do whatever you want and what the database of Zork lets you do. You can walk around, and it always takes you where you are, what you see. For instance, you start up in front of this house, you see a mailbox. You can open the mailbox. You open the mailbox. There's a leaflet inside. You take the leaflet, you read it, and it's like, "Welcome to Zork." And then it tells you nothing anymore, and you just have to figure out what to do, like go east, go west, go north, go south. And this is how you move on. You come to a forest, you get to a canyon, you come to a house, which, as it turned out, was Scarabrea 1, which was kind of depressing. But this is how you move in the world, and this is what I experienced in during my 7 minutes.
And you did try valiantly to teach the program new words.
Yeah, I even wanted to argue with the program, and at the end I got a little bit snappy and bitchy, but other than that, for me, the way this program, the program doesn't think, but the way the programmers thought when creating the program is a little bit confusing to me, because nowadays games have so many fail safes in them. There's so much, you don't have to jump exactly over the cliff to reach the other side. Sometimes the game just gives you a little push so you don't fall to death, and as I've mentioned in those earlier games, this push just wasn't there because of limitations in hardware and programming and whatnot. And in a text-based adventure, those limitations really become obvious when you have a typo, when you use a word, when you use syntax that's just not in the database. You basically do the right thing, you're just using the wrong words, and you don't get anywhere because of that.
So there were no context-sensitive buttons like in Conquer.
Yes, there's no context sensitivity. I really missed my dear old drunken scarecrow.
How did the immersion factor work for you? Did you find it immersive?
Funnily, yes, for some reason. Because, it just gave me some basic lines. You're standing in front of a house. The weird thing is, because I'm such a creative guy with a great mind, full of fantasy, the inner child in me just came, at least after work. Anyways, so the inner child in me really came through, and I saw this house standing in front of me, and I saw the leaflet. I read the leaflet. And then I didn't know anything else about the surrounding area because it just described to me the house. But then I typed in go west, and it told me I'm standing in front of a forest. And all of a sudden, right next to the house, on the west side of the house, there was this forest in front of my inner eye. And then it texted me, I'm standing in front of a huge tree with low-hanging branches. And for me, it was obvious that I somehow can climb up this tree. And this is something I think this is really interesting. I mean, in the modern games nowadays, the graphics are so cool that those programmers really have to give you clues on where you can climb onto and where not. Usually you have some color coding, you have some white smear or whatnot around the edges of whatever you can climb up. And in Zork, it just gave me the clue there is a tree with low-hanging branches. And this really was the signal like, okay, I can climb up this tree. There were other trees before this because obviously I'm in a forest, but just pointing out there is this one specific tree with low-hanging branches. I wanted to climb this up. And on the tree, I found a nest with a egg full of jewels, so a Fabergé egg. And I just took the egg, and just because I could, I also took the nest. And I climbed down the tree. And here's the interesting thing. You have to climb down the tree before you move on, before you go east, go north, go wherever, because being on the tree, typing in go east, it's like, no, you can't do that. The funny thing is, it doesn't tell you can't do this because you're moron, you're still standing on the tree, and when you go north right now, you just fall down. It doesn't do that. Just like you can't do this, and you have to figure out on your own, damn, I'm still on the tree, which in the mind of a modern gamer is like, I don't have to picture that. Usually I see that I'm on a tree, and usually I jump down this tree, take the hit, get some potion, and move on because it's way quicker than just climbing down the thing.
So basically what you're saying is a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Well, or 5 words in the case of Zork.
Very true. And this was your first go at a text adventure.
Oh, yes, it was my first go at a text adventure, so I'm not a text adventure virgin anymore. Feels weird, but also weirdly satisfying.
So, was it good for you?
Yes. God, Jesus. And it was a nice experience, It's not like I expected more. I basically got what I expected.
Very cool. Very cool. I'm glad to hear that. We may have to go down this hole again in the future at some point, but
there's too many references here, dude.
There's so, oh, I didn't even think about that right there. Oh well. Okay, but before we can turn on the time machine, we are going to have to check in with our good friend Ethan for the Department of Corrections.
Welcome back to the show, Ethan, to the Department of Corrections. What do you got for us for our 1981 jump into... Oh, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself again. We have important business.
Yes, it is the Peter comment.
Okay, I appreciate your enthusiasm and the little wiggle in your head when you do that, but it's an audio podcast. Nobody can see that.
Well, they'll catch the Scotch snaps.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
All right. The Peter comment this time is his reference to Ozzy Osbourne, proving that he, despite being young, is more cultured than Carl.
Oh. What did he say about Ozzy again?
About biting the head off a bat. You were talking about the Osbourne computer. So.
Oh, true. It took me a second to make that connection.
Yeah.
I feel old.
All right, so we are docking into the station. Did you see what I did there? All right.
I saw it. It's a nice hand movement.
Yeah. And first of all, you're talking about the Atari VCS and how by 1981 you were saying that they still have some techniques to dream up, but really no. By the time in 1981, especially the people at Activision have used every trick in the book. You just use it in kind of different ways to get something like Hero on the screen or whatnot. But like everything in terms of the display tricks, like Venetian blinds and V-stop, I think it's called. There's all these very strange techniques that make absolutely no sense. But very recently, Retro Game Mechanics Explained did a video on this. If you want to learn more about the Atari VCS hardware and how it actually is able to draw things on screen with no video memory, hardly at all. So like by 1981, that stuff is figured out. It's just, but there's still plenty of ingenuity going on. So in that sense, you're right.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I mean, Hero is a perfect example, which comes out, I believe, after the crash in '84 or something,
84.
and pushes the machine to a whole different level. But you're right. Yeah, most of those tricks had already been figured out because let's face it, that hardware didn't have a lot of tricks in it. And the video that you're talking about, yeah, I've been sending that out to all of my friends because that was just amazing. I mean, to actually see it the way they described it. I'll put it in the show notes. Everybody needs to watch that.
Yes, and on that, Mark, you said chasing the beam, but the term they used at the time was racing the beam.
Yeah, I got that one wrong. That's true.
Also the name of a book by Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort, which is highly technical, and you're better off just watching the video. All right. On from that, you were mentioning the Cinematronix lawsuit, where a bunch of importers no longer are able to sell Star Castle games. The name of the other company was called K-Noma Enterprises. At least that was the main one in the suit. There were actually three defendants. One was an actual distributor in the U.S., but the other two were Japanese-based companies.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for that. Because I tried to look them up and I couldn't find them and ran out of time to keep going deeper.
Yeah. In part, I've got that because I was putting together a Cinematronix timeline thing, which put out with my Sega Gremlin one too, because I'm doing something on both of those because they're in the same area. And cool. On from that, you were mentioning that Atari Japan was being founded, the second attempt at Atari Japan. But this is only relegated to the coin-op realm. So you went off in a tangent about how the VCS wasn't successful in Japan, but that's not the company that put out the VCS, so it didn't really have anything to do with that.
Who put out the VCS in Japan?
It was, I believe, Atari. Well, originally it was Epoch. Epoch in 1980, or Epic is actually the proper pronunciation of it. They, in 1980, put out the VCS originally, and then in 1983, Atari put out the VCS as the 2800. But it was through Atari International, which was the division in the U.S. It was not through Atari Japan.
Gotcha. Interesting. Is there any explanation of why they kept Atari Japan arcade exclusive? Or
well, all the divisions of the company were like that.
Gotcha.
There wasn't. To operate in these other markets, you had to, set up a company there in a lot of cases. There was an Atari France at one point, of course, Atari Ireland. So coin-op always was very separate, and then in the structure of the company, there was basically Atari Domestic and Atari International, headed by a guy named Michael Bruhl, and he oversaw all the markets that they were going into. Sometimes they had to do foreign partners, sometimes they could go directly, but it was under their auspice of Atari International.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
You wanted to talk about Steve Bristow in his new role as kind of the chief guy dreaming up products for the future. And you mentioned that he had a role in the decision whether to release the Nintendo Famicom or not. He would not have been the decision man on that. And while Atari had a system that they were working on before the 5200, after that was the 7800 was not their technology. That was from the guys over in Massachusetts, General Computer Corporation. So Bristow was not the one who made the decision. That would have been a higher up person. There were basically camps. There were some Atari engineers who wanted to go with the Famicom so that they didn't have to go with General Computer Corporation, and then another group who were, battling for the 7800. But in point of fact, the reason that it got scuttled is because the negotiations fell apart after Ray Kassar got fired.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going off of a quote from Bristow where he was talking about how he had done the evaluation of the hardware and decided that it wasn't what they wanted to do. And he was taking credit for it in an interview. So it makes sense that, the buck probably didn't stop with him on that one.
Yeah, he is a person in the decision making, and he would have been somebody who would have been the person evaluating that hardware. But in actuality, his influence would not have been the final stop on that. And it was a protracted thing. There is a basically written up contract. They were almost going to do it. And then Ray Kassar gets fired. And then negotiations are over.
Gotcha. So, okay. So whoever, I can't remember who follows Kassar in the job, but
James Morgan.
Yeah, but his job was basically just wrap this up and sell the company.
He was supposed to save the company. So they brought him in to be a marketing guy who could push them through this problem that they had. Alex has more info on this because he actually interviewed Morgan. So leave that part to him. But, Morgan was not privy to these negotiations originally.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
All right. And next up, another Atari bit. Of course, in the 1980s, you're going to be talking a lot about Atari. You said APX ran for a number of years, and it stopped in April of 1984 is when they finally just wrapped it up because they didn't want to do mail order stuff anymore. Because that's the only way you could actually get Atari Program Exchange games was mail order.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
And then following point from that, you were saying that the Atari Program Exchange was basically a reaction to Jack Trammell's strategy of software. And I don't really think that's the case, especially because to set something like this up that has kind of a marketing structure and everything, you would have needed to been developing this for a long time. I mean, there were platforms with open software and platforms without open software for a long time, but I don't think it necessarily had to do with Commodore's strategy.
Oh, okay. Makes sense, yeah. Cool. Is that it? Is that all I got wrong?
That's all we will do for May of 1981.
I'm not the only one who gets those years wrong. Thank you. Thank you. I feel better now.
Even though it's right in front of me. Anyways.
Exactly. And welcome to my world. Okay, then we will see you on our next time jump, Ethan. As always, thank you for your service.
Scotch snaps.
Rapidly becoming an international craze. 1981.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer.
Right in the midst of it, thank you.
I'm always wondering whether he actually is a library in himself or whether he goes to an online library to research and show us our faults just for shits and giggles.
Ethan has been doing this for so long and has interviewed so many people and written so many books already. He's actually written books on this stuff. He is our living, breathing encyclopedia of knowledge on these things. And this is why we give him his segment every week, and he does his thing very, very well. We are very glad to have him on board.
I mean, showing you where you are wrong actually takes some, courage on the one hand and actually some knowledge on the other hand, because even if you are not right, you'll present as always as being the one and absolute truth, which surely stems from you being a lawyer by education. So, and a teacher right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I have that aura of authority about me that, wow, yeah.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it authority.
It's responsibility over the future of people, and I never thought of it that way. Now I'm getting cold feet. Oh my goodness!
Dude, it's just business English. People just take it to get some credit, so relax.
Oh! You wound me
in your face.
Soul. You wound me, sir. You wound me. Okay, enough of that. Let's turn on the time machine, and before we go to June of 1981, we need to make a stop in June of 1961. And we have no sound effect for this one, so go for it.
So, since we have no sound effect for this, I'll just go for it. IBM 1301 drive introduces hydrodynamic air-bearing slider.
The first hard drive to use a hydrodynamic air-bearing slider, which generated its own air cushion separating the reading needle from the platter, has been introduced. The previous hard drive designs used pressurized air and kept the needle much further away from the platter.
You know what this feels like?
What?
This feels like the future is now. Wasn't that the technology that makes, not SSDs, but nowadays hard drives possible?
Yes. Some variation of this air cushion idea is basically the way all hard drives work nowadays.
Yeah.
And because, they're magnetic media, you can't put the needle directly on the platter. If that air cushion is gone, the needle's going to hit the platter, you're done. And the previous systems were constantly pushing air in there, which meant that you had to have a much bigger mechanism because you had to be able to focus the air and stuff. And it also kept the needle much further from the hard drive. Yeah. This concept is going to make the hard drives as we know them possible.
Mm-hmm. So, help me out. Earlier you had something that pumped air into the hard drive?
Yes. So you were basically pumping this constant stream of air that kept the needle above the platter.
Okay.
Huh. Yeah. Well, and it was just kind of the way that you had to do it. And this new way of doing it, this air cushion, and do not ask me the physics of how this thing works. I honestly don't know. I tried to read up on it. I have no clue. But you have this tiny little air cushion, and this allows you to be much, much closer. You don't have to have this motor pumping air in constantly. And it makes the hard drives, these tiny little compact hard drives as we know them, possible. And yeah, they're not that small at this point yet, but they will get that small relatively quickly. And, by the 20 years later, they're going to be somewhat affordable for home computers. Still going to be thousands of dollars, but the prices are going to be coming down. And you're going to basically get the mass storage we know today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So an important milestone on the way to all things computer gaming.
Not bad. I never really thought about how the needle in a hard drive kept its exact distance from the platter below, and using pressurized air. Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah, and there's I've got links in the show notes to Wikipedia entries on this. I'm sure that there's some technicians out there who could explain it much better than I can. If any of our listeners have done deep dives on this, let us know. We'll have you on the show. We can do a whole special on the evolution of this tech. I wouldn't mind finding it out myself. So, but it was an important enough event, and it was reported in the New York Times, linked to that article below, and so it's here.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay, I think we can now turn on the time machine, head back 40 years to June of 1981. Do-do-do-do-do. Welcome to June of 1981. Peter, what's our first story?
Midway gets counterfeits seized.
In a follow-up to Cinematronix win with Star Castle that we talked about last month, Midway has gotten a U.S. District Court in Nebraska and Arizona to send U.S. Marshals out to seize video games and circuit boards that violate their Galaxian, Pac-Man, and Rally X copyrights. Some of the games in question were straight copies, while others were variations like Mighty Mouth and Space Fever. In L.A., the U.S. Customs Service has ordered over 100 Gobbler games returned to the port for violating Pac-Man copyrights. Courts seem to be getting behind the cease and infringing product remedy, with an Alabama court forcing an infringing operator who was assembling Defender games from kits to hand over the infringing hardware to Williams.
So, how can I picture that? The court sent out the U.S. Marshals who went into video game places and took away those circuit boards. They just basically carried out the arcade cabinet.
Well, in some cases they were full arcade cabinets. In other ones it was just the circuit boards. A lot of this stuff is not being manufactured in the U.S. It's being manufactured someplace in Asia. So if you just pull out the circuit board, that's pretty much all you need. Can you
picture in like 50, 60 something years old U.S. Marshal being in those places he's never been before in? Well, and standing there in front of those arcade cabinets, and it's all just like colors to him. He's like, okay, what the hell? What am I supposed to do here? What should I carry out?
That is an excellent question. I can imagine some of them being a little bit bewildered by pulling out computer boards because it's something that most people at this point have never seen in person. And this is really one of those areas. This is one of those moments where, and I mean, as a lawyer, we talk about this all the time. Where what does the law do with a novel problem? What do you do with something that you haven't seen before? I mean, if you're selling counterfeit copies of a novel, the law enforcement officers know what to look for. They're looking for certain books with certain names on the covers. Here, you got this printed circuit board, probably doesn't have a name on it. How are you identifying it? And all this other stuff. And that is a relatively complicated thing. They may have had some kind of advisors with them, or maybe even people from the company coming along as experts to help identify equipment. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, how else are you going to do it? How else do you know that you're seizing the right product? And they're probably not taking these directly out of arcades, even though they probably were in some cases. But they're probably going after the manufacturer's warehouse or something. Yeah. So, yeah. And these guys, and the one is the customs service, is basically stuff is coming through customs. It needs to get inspected by the customs officer. And so they're just stopping the stuff before it can even come in. Yeah. So they're just sending it back across the ocean. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and it's 100 boards at a time. I mean, that's not an inconsiderable number of machines. And that was just one shipment. Yeah,
exactly. Totally true. I'm still picturing some geared up FBI guys like exploding or like bashing a door in and just shooting randomly at random arcade cabinets.
Yeah. Die.
Exactly.
They hear the wagga, 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 wagga. And they're like, they got a gun. It's a machine gun.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
But we're taking the seriousness out of this and back in character. Next topic. Centipede launches.
Atari Centipede hits the market. Not only is the game massively successful and a classic, but it is also the first game programmed by Donna Bailey, most likely the first woman to program an arcade game.
This is actually an interesting thing. I mean, women were the first programmers, wasn't it?
Well, if you go back to Lovelace, you could say yes, the first computer programmer was a woman. And if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, the women who were doing the programming on these big mainframes and stuff, the whole punch card thing, it was largely women doing it. Yes.
Exactly. And then we get to games, and then you have the first woman in 1981. I mean, still, it's a pretty long time ago. But for video games, it's comparatively late.
Well, I mean, yes. And I guess there's a cultural shift here that is important to remember, that the programming that the women were doing, I mean, you didn't have, as far as I can tell, a lot of women that were doing, for example, what the Don Daglows of the world were doing, where, it was this obsessive jump on the machines at midnight when you can get some time in college and making stuff and experimenting. These were more, and a friend of my father's, she was one of these programmers back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And she worked for the telephone company. But what she was programming was basically these standardized routines. And there was a problem solving involved, but it wasn't one of those things where, if you asked her, well, would you go onto the machine at night, and try to make a game or something? She'd be like, no, I was just punching in, solving the problem that I needed to solve, and then I went home. So
exactly, they are not making a big fuss out of it. They're
not making a big fuss. It wasn't this obsessive, compulsive thing, and
because they had a family
people,
to take care of as well.
Well, that too, and this hacker mentality, the hacker mentality evolved into a bit of a boys' club, And
of course, because the women were doing the cooking and the laundry and all the stuff, so the men had.
And it just kind of splits off at some point. I mean, if you look at the guys who developed Adventure and Zork and stuff, even though somebody like Roberta Williams falls in love with these adventure games and then wants to make her own, that original batch of these hardcore college students working on this stuff are all men. And it was very hard for women to get into the engineering programs and stuff where you would have learned these skills. And so, you just had that split, and it's taken a very, very long time, and it really still hasn't met parity, but it's taken a very long time for women to claw back some of that ground. And if you look at a lot of the ads for home computers in this time, it's largely about little Johnny having the computer up in his room.
Of course.
Once they get past the, mom's going to put her recipes on here, it becomes about little Johnny in his room, doing stuff on the computer, and maybe dad doing some work. And this is going to create a barrier later on, especially in the mid to late 80s, where women just aren't coming in with that home experience of programming, which is almost going to become a prerequisite in a lot of colleges. So it becomes a problem. But Donna Bailey, massive personality at this point, very important in the development of the game. And it's another one of these games that, even though it's a shooter, is going to have quite a bit of cross gender appeal.
Of course.
And it's going to become, I believe, Atari's second best-selling arcade cabinet of all time.
Huh.
Yeah. I almost had this as your 7-Minute in Heaven game, but the original arcade cabinet used a trackball, and without the trackball, it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, I'm more or less happy with the game you gave me.
That you haven't played yet.
That I haven't played yet.
Yeah.
As of.
Yeah. Let's just get that out of the way, because we're going to have to talk about it in a little bit. So it just makes it easier. Okay.
I have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
As always, moving on. Play Cable hits the market.
After its initial launch in test markets in 1979, Play Cable, the service that lets users download Intellivision games over cable lines, has now been promoted at the annual Cable Television Convention. It as well as other interactive services, face an uphill battle as most cable providers are limited to just 12 channels and don't have the equipment to allow for information upload from consumers.
This is technology which is just too far behind for me to fully grasp.
Well, okay, let me set the scene. Most cable companies at this point are relatively small operations. Now, there's still a lot of investment because what they're doing in the U.S. is running the cable lines along the telephone masts. Because in the States, most of the electrical lines aren't underground, especially at this point. So you're running these cables through different neighborhoods and stuff to connect people to the cable company. But you also need equipment back at the headquarters to process all the different television channels. So most of the cable companies are only have equipment for 12 channels at any one time. And this is still linear television. So you have 12 channels that are just being beamed out to the consumers. So if you want to have a cable channel, what you probably have is the three big networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. You might have a PBS channel if there's a PBS channel locally. Then maybe one or two small UHF channels, local independent broadcasters that you're also broadcasting on the cable channel. So let's say 5 or 6 channels are eaten up just by this. Now you're also going to be offering HBO and Showtime, which are the two big pay cable channels that are encoded, maybe a porn channel or something like that. You're running out of channels relatively quickly. And if you're going to do this in television thing, you need a whole channel just for broadcasting the games. And the way it works is like a modem, but it's just repeating the information, the data for the games. So if you have the Intellivision at home with the Play Cable cartridge, and you say, well, I want game 4 of the however many games they offered every month, 5 or 6 or whatever, then it would say, okay, waiting, and it would wait until that game started to download on the system, and then it would just record that signal onto the ROM cartridge that you put into the Intellivision for the Play Cable stuff. And then you would be able to play it as long as you didn't turn the system off. And then when you did turn the system off, you'd have to download the game again to play it again.
Okay.
And then on top of that, you'd have to add some hardware to your system to be able to receive a signal from the Intellivision consumer, I believe. So they're talking about some kind of upload signal was also necessary. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, but that would be an additional investment for the cable company. So the cable companies would have to make an investment in their system in order to support this. And the question is, well, is the equipment upgrade going to be justified with the additional income? And do you want to sacrifice one of the 12 channels that you can broadcast with this system? I mean, it's just it's a profit proposition at the end of the day. And for most cable companies, it's going to be a hard no, a hard pass.
Oh yeah,
because they just don't have the customer base, and the Intellivision is not really setting the world on fire with sales at this point. I mean, they are by far the also ran because the Atari 2600 is so big.
I think I got it.
Yeah. But they're making a push. It's out there, and they're promoting it at the cable television conventions. So who knows? And they're going to pick up some markets, and there will be some people who can get it, but it's going to be limited.
Yeah. Okay. Oh well, I think for this really all this connectiveness really to work, you have to have the internet. Everything else is just.
Yeah, and I mean, there's going to be similar services later for the 2600 and stuff, and Sega's going to do something similar in the 90s with Sega Net, for the Genesis. But yeah, it's all just a little too early. You need the internet. You need such a broad spectrum of content available that it pays off, that enough people are going to be willing to jump on board and buy the service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Still. All this technical stuff. Jesus.
Let's get back to business. Come on.
Let's get back to business. Exactly.
Money.
This is something I pretend to understand. Video games are conquering toy stores.
With 1980 having marked the launch of video game cartridges being sold in mass toy retailers like Toys R Us, Toy and Hobby World magazine has an extensive article about what are the key features of retailing games that toy retailers should consider. Jim Levy, president of Activision, sees game systems evolving into the low end of the market, with computers being the high end, and compares the market's future to the record business, where the retailers will either concentrate on the hits or try to carry whole catalogs with hardware ranging from high-end stereos to boomboxes. The president of toy chain King Norman's interestingly says that they regularly have waiting lists of 40 to 50 customers for the hottest new titles.
Oh, well, it almost feels like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X all over again.
Yeah, basically that's what you're seeing. And the important thing here is that the toy retailers are getting into it. It's no longer sort of the electronics departments or specialty stores selling the stuff. It's now hitting the toy retailers. And in many ways, this is going to bring video games to the masses. And in many ways, this is the setup for the crash of '83.
Yeah.
Because toy retailers are going to handle this stuff like toys, which are fads, which come and go. Whereas I think the electronics industry, had it stayed in the electronics or the sporting goods departments of department stores, they would have taken a very different approach to the product.
Yeah, of course, and maybe a more fitting approach.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what did those toy stores exactly? I mean, in which way were they responsible for the game crash? Which was the biggest mistake they've made?
Probably the biggest mistake they made was just not looking at the quality of the product, not understanding the quality of the product or the importance of quality. And because they were in so many different areas simultaneously, they just thought, okay, it's going to be like any other industry. And also because the toy business has always been a bit of a cutthroat business, a lot of the practices of the toy business, like, well, if we think your company's going broke, we won't pay you, we won't pay what we owe you from the Christmas sales. And if you want to sue us, try it. That kind of approach, which was very common in the toy industry. And Ed Zarin talked about it in my interview with him. Don Daglow talked about it also in my interview with him. That approach ended up tanking a lot of companies that may have survived otherwise. A lot of companies just never were going to be able to survive. And a glut of product that then got sold on the cheap, it killed any interest from the retailers in the future. And because they were the main source of sales, well, now if you couldn't sell them any new product because they were still trying to get rid of their old product, you were basically screwed. Granted, this is something we will talk about extensively in the next couple of years. But the fact that they're the ones who are going to be carrying this banner, the ones that are going to be moving forward with the industry, is setting us up for great heights, because they can promote the stuff and sell it in ways that the other retailers never would be able to. But at the same time, it's also setting us up for the biggest of crashes.
Well, they sold the stuff the way that other retailers weren't able to.
Well, that's true. But unfortunately, that also meant that they were selling the stuff like they would sell any other toy. And video games aren't any other toy. They're a different type of product altogether.
Exactly. Yeah. Video games aren't toys. Video games are sophisticated works of art.
Yes, they are. I laugh, but I completely agree with that sentiment.
Yeah. Well, most of the time. And because they are works of art, there are people that can estimate their value, and they basically hit the spot.
Wow, you are so out of practice with these transitions. You are really out of practice.
I am. Okay, and I'm also a little bit out of practice with my English, so
there you go.
This makes it way harder. Anyhow, programmable video game market to reach $295 million in revenue by 1990! Exclamation mark.
Exactly. Industry predictions for the electronic game market from International Resource Development Incorporated show that programmable games will increase in revenue from $220 million in 1980 to $295 million in 1990. Of course, this will be a paltry sum compared to the non-video electronic game market that will see handheld games go from $510 million to $820 million in 1990, and the electronic chess and similar category going from $170 to $275 million.
Let me ask you one thing a little quick.
Yes.
Is any of those predictions correct?
Oh, hell no. Hell no. Okay, the electronic chess and similar game market doesn't even exist really by 1990. I mean, you can still buy a couple of electronic chessboards, but they're basically dead. The electronic handheld game market has a slight resurgence around this time with Acclaim and Konami releasing and Tiger Electronics releasing games. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's not an $820 million market, not even close. And the actual value of the U.S. console game market, the programmable video being that it's on a TV screen, market in the United States in 1990 was a paltry $5.1 billion.
So who were those guys from the International Resource Development Inc.?
They were a research company, as far as I can tell, because I've seen their numbers pop up in these trade magazines multiple times now. I think we even quoted them once before. They're just an industry research group that's trying to figure out the trends. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they get it this wrong, the fact that they're imagining, that video game thing, it'll never really catch on, has mainly to do, and they talk about this, that it's just a transition. Just like Jim Levy was talking about how video games was just this passing fad because computer games were going to rule the roost. That was the thing that was going to take it over. And they even said it here. It's like, it'll have its day in the sun, but by 1990, everybody's going to be playing on computers. Who cares? And, the really cheap market is going to be the handheld games. People will love those. They'll get more complex, and that'll be great. And, it's the fact that everybody across the board seems to be expecting this boom in computers that is never going to supplant consoles is just kind of amazing.
On the one hand, I think it's just a couple of old white men not knowing what they are talking about and just looking at some numbers and not the way this entire stuff feels, Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I kind of can understand where they're coming from. I mean, if you just think that a computer is way more versatile than a console and mom and pa can use it for their Excel calculations, letter writing, whatnot, and then you have the kid that can play on that thing as well, it kind of makes sense to assume that why should I buy a console when I can buy a computer, and I have this working station for Ma and Pa and this game station for my kids in one system, you know?
Exactly.
So it kind of makes sense.
And also remember, we've been talking about the dawn of the online system for years now on the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody thought it was just around the corner. It was like they were going to unlock, check your stock portfolio on the computer, play games on the computer, send out letters on the computer. Everything was going to be on this system. And it just did not feel like this was going to take another 15 years to come to fruition.
Yeah.
Everybody just thought, okay, this technology is going to happen. And the fact that the home computers at this time are still relatively paltry in their capabilities and are never really going to do any of those functions truly well was something that nobody wanted to buy into.
Yeah.
And the fact that the video game consoles did one thing really, really well, play games, is going to be their strength.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even today, where the console is nothing else than basically a standardized computer, even nowadays, the computer cannot really get a win over the console market. It's like a peaceful coexistence, more or less peaceful.
Yeah. I mean, and it makes sense because there's a difference between being relaxed on your couch and playing on your big screen TV or playing in front of your computer. It's just a different experience.
Yes, of course. I mean, but you can hook up nowadays you can easily hook up your TV screen with your computer wirelessly, Steam Link and all that stuff.
Yeah, I've tried that. Come on.
Yeah,
if your computer's on the other floor of the house, forget about it. That's nonsense. It's not that easy. Nobody really does it except maybe some hardcore geeks. And for the average everyday user, those two worlds never meet. Or they're playing casual games on their phone while taking a dump. I mean, it's those are two separate worlds. And we see it in the types of games that are available that are successful and so forth.
Yeah.
It's just two different worlds, and it's okay that they're two different worlds. That's perfectly fine. And at this point, they hadn't figured that out yet. It just wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
And we're not done with. Now we have to head over to CES because there's some big announcements.
Yes. Magnavox pushes Odyssey 2 at the CES.
We haven't talked a lot about the Odyssey 2 on the show, as the system has failed to make many waves since its launch in North America in 1979. Magnavox seems to be trying to change that at CES, promoting games like Quest for the Rings, an action-adventure board game hybrid, and a weird $1 million in $1 bills display at their stand with the tagline, "How you can make $1 million selling Odyssey."
This sounds like a pyramid scheme.
Something like that. And the Odyssey, in some ways, I mean, the Bally Arcade also comes out, I believe, maybe even a little bit before it. I'd have to check the timeline. But the Odyssey was a console that had a full keyboard. I mean, it had the chiclet, ZX80 style keyboard, but it had a keyboard. It was meant, we were supposed to be able to program on it as well as play games. And it has failed to really take off. Philips, who bought Magnavox years earlier, was, I believe, the lead designers of the device. It also came out in Europe first under a different name. But yeah, they're trying to get retailers to sell it. They're trying to get everybody to go along with the system, but it'll make some headlines once we get to Casey Munchkin and stuff. There's going to be some lawsuits, but for right now, they're trying weird gimmicky stuff like a board game that you play on the computer as well and stuff, and it just doesn't work.
Well, I think I've mentioned it before, but the 1980s are, for me, they are a time where people just try out different stuff. like to try out the traditional game stuff and connect it somehow to electronics and video games and consoles and whatnot. But it never really worked. Never.
Yeah, I mean, they're experimenting. They're trying stuff.
Yeah.
You got to give them credit. I mean, Infocom's going to try the same thing almost a decade later.
Yeah.
The board game, computer game hybrid nonsense. But they don't really have a concept because they're not a games company. They're not coming from a tradition of, well, what makes a good game? They're coming from a tradition of, we know what makes really cool high-end hardware, but translating that into something that makes good games requires people who like to make games. Yeah. And that's what they're missing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about missing stuff, Bally Arcade gets keyboard add-on.
Astrovision, the company that took over distribution of the Bally Arcade, has launched a keyboard add-on that turns the console into a more capable computer. With an extra 32K of RAM and 24K ROM, Astrovision claims it is the easiest computer to use on the market.
Oh Lord, the old discussion, what makes a console and a computer a computer?
Exactly. And this is why this is an interesting transition, because everybody is betting on console is temporary, computer is the future. Mm-hmm. And the Bally Arcade always had a programmability built in. It had this number pad on the front, and you could enter in basic programs, or no, not basic. They had their own programming language. You could enter them in using hexadecimal codes. So, the commands would be represented by number codes.
Wonderful. This is so user-friendly.
Extremely user-friendly. And now you can actually enter those codes with a keyboard. But awesome. It required extra RAM. It required extra RAM to be able to process the keyboard inputs and to display the key, the stuff. So it makes sense that you had to upgrade the machine. Remember, RAM at this point is still extremely expensive. So if you want to release a product that could survive on the market, you're going to have to be very, very, You're going to have to be very Scrooge-like with your RAM, with your RAM, and so this will hopefully change that.
And this is so funny. I mean, just the pricing level is so uncommon today. I mean, hey, here is your $300, $400, $500 computer, console, whatnot. And there's your $200 keyboard. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the problem is that the building this physical keyboard is extremely expensive.
Oh yeah, sure.
Especially at this time, because I mean they're not usually using the chiclet keyboard underneath. It's in a physical keyboard. Okay. So that manufacturing cost is in there, and you're not talking huge numbers of units. You're not really getting the economies of scale out of this.
Yeah.
So if you could say, oh, we're going to move at least 3 million of these, you'd get a whole different cost structure. But they're probably thinking, well, we'll make a first batch of 10,000 and see what happens. You're now going to have to make a profit off of that, and you're selling it at retail, so now you're only making half of the sales price, and then so on and so forth, maybe even less, depending on how many in-betweens there are, if you're a small company. And this is why these things it's just an extremely expensive hobby to be a part of at this point, and it's not that big of a hobby, and there's so many different systems on the market that you're competing against.
Such as Mattel, which delays the Intellivision keyboard.
In other news, water is wet.
Really?
Yeah. Mattel has once again delayed nationwide distribution of the Intellivision keyboard component, citing the need to further investigate consumer attitudes. The keyboard, which was meant to launch in 1980, was delayed to the first half of 1981 and has now been taken off of the 81 launch slate. This story from Toys, Hobbies, and Crafts is contradicted by the Leisure Time Electronics Report, the daily newsletter published during CES, in which Mattel Vice President of Sales Richard Hogue assures everyone that the launch will happen in the fall in 5 cities and that a national launch, when done, will be done right.
I mean, I remember the story of the Intellivision keyboard, but still, I mean, it's like, oh, the new console generation is released and everyone wants to have it, and they're basically talking the same language, just about a keyboard.
Well, sort of. Remember, the keyboard has its own CPU that is not compatible with the CPU in the Intellivision, and is basically a huge problem. It doesn't do anything really very well, and it was meant to be more of an educational tool or turn it into a computer, but it wasn't going to be a very good computer. Yeah. And they had already launched in 2 test markets, and as far as I can tell, these 5 cities that Hogue is talking about launching it in, it never gets launched in those. And so, yeah, it's just a problem. And as Don Daglow told us, because he was originally working on software for the keyboard add-on, he got taken off of that very early. So at this point, there's not even any real development happening for software for this thing. So even if it does launch, there's no programs available for it.
Just like with the new console generation. Cool.
Yeah,
I'm sorry I'm getting back to that, but just today I had a look whether or not it's possible to buy a PlayStation 5 now, and how shocking it's not.
Really? They're still out? Oh my goodness, I haven't followed it at all.
Oh, you haven't followed it? Yeah.
Well, I followed it a little bit, but I haven't been following it on a weekly basis or anything. That's just sad.
I mean, you can buy that thing for like $1,000 or more bucks from some scalpers, but then again, who does this? And then again, many people, because otherwise those offers wouldn't exist. So.
Yeah, and then what would you actually play on it?
And this is the next thing. Nothing. Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I get this thing sooner or later. It's just I will not buy it from somewhere else than from, I don't know, some retailer.
Well, by the time the new consoles are available, you'll know whether or not the new Bethesda Xbox exclusives are worth buying an Xbox for. So that'll make it all worthwhile.
Yeah, I'm actually not really looking for an Xbox. I went with the Xbox One and, well...
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, but now they've got Bethesda, so who knows? If you want a good RPG, you may have to. We'll see.
We'll see, exactly. And this is what I have a computer for.
Exactly.
Anyhow, speaking about that, moving on, Texas Instruments gets out of the digital watch business, but Commodore sticks with it.
Texas Instruments has announced at CES that they are getting out of the digital watch business. With a ton of new watches debuting at the show and the price points dropping precipitously, the semiconductor giant has decided to abandon the market just as their TI-99 for a computer is hitting retail. Commodore, on the other hand, has decided to double down and seize a place for themselves in the sub-$20 watch market.
Well, we talked a little bit before we started recording, and you told me this is one of the super important topics, and I want to get to that, but before that, just a comment. They were showing digital watches at the Consumer Electronics Show.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a consumer electronics product. Digital watches were a big deal. The idea that you could have a digital watch. And these digital watches are slowly getting more and more functionalities. They've got calculator watches coming up and stuff like this. This was the hot new tech. You didn't want to get caught.
Well, okay.
Analog.
I agree with that. Yeah. Okay. Today we have like those stuff like Apple Watch and smartwatches.
Exactly.
So it's
and those are also being shown off at CES. So
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It requires a CPU. It requires electronics in it. and it's for the consumer.
Consumers. Exactly. So
It's kind of in the
all
name.
the boxes checked.
Yeah.
I remember just from my primary school times, I remember those super, super fat digital watches, Baby G and whatever they are called. And they basically looked like, well, round chunks of something on your wrist.
Well, I mean, at this point, they still look. I mean, those weren't. These aren't stylized for little kids. I mean, these are still very expensive products at this point. But the prices are dropping really, really fast. The same thing had happened to the calculator market a few years earlier, and just like there, Commodore stuck with it for a little bit longer. Texas Instruments just cannot or doesn't want to handle the low end of the market. I mean, Texas Instruments were the ones that destroyed the calculator market by getting into it and just collapsing it because they had the vertical integration.
Oh, yeah.
And Commodore, because they own MOS Technologies, also has vertical integration. They can handle it. They can go cheaper. They're willing to go cheaper. But the reason this is important is that it foreshadows a little conflict that's coming in a couple of years. When Commodore releases the C64, and or maybe even happens next year. I can't remember. It might be even next year when Commodore basically announces that they're cutting the cost of all of their peripherals, and Texas Instruments is only going to be turning a profit on the TI-99 based on the sale of peripherals. So what they're doing is they're selling the TI-99 at a loss in order to make money off things like printers and disk drives and whatnot. And when Commodore announces that they're going to drop the price of their peripherals, and I can't remember if it was for the C64 or for the VIC-20. We'll see when we get to that story. TI just, at CES, once they hear that, they literally just announce, we're done, we're out. And so in a certain way, this feels like it's a foreshadowing of that conflict that's coming. But we'll see. I mean, it's coming, but it's still a little ways down the pipeline.
Okay, peaceful times ahead.
Yeah, something like that.
Moving on. Micro Magazine begins pushing the 6809.
Growing impatient with the aging 6502 chip, Micro Magazine has decided to promote Motorola's 6809 as the next generation chip for those whose programs have outgrown the 6502. While the 6809 would find a home in the TRS-80 color computer, Dragon 32, Thomson, and Vectrex, as well as various arcade games, it would fail to gain traction when going up against the true 6502 successor, MOS's own 6510, Motorola's own 68000, and, of course, Intel x86 line. That was a lot of numbers, wasn't it?
Yeah, this is what I was about to say. This is just... Oh, Lord.
So remember, the 6502 is the chip that was powering the Apple II and the Commodore PET. And the 6502 is also what's going to be powering, or variations of the 6502 will be powering the NES, will be powering the Commodore 64, and this chip family is going to still be important for quite a while. But a lot of people are starting to get antsy, and this is also kind of the end, or it's the dying gasp of this. If you buy a computer, you're buying it to program it yourself, and you are not afraid to pop chips out, put chips in the board, create add-on boards for your computer, all this stuff. This is still that era of computing in its final grasp. We talked a lot about in the past how VisiCalc is the beginning of, I buy the computer to perform a specific function and I don't plan on programming it myself. Wild Bill Staley, that's why he bought his first computer, because he needed VisiCalc. He never intended to program on it. He never learned how to program, but he knew how to use VisiCalc. So Micro Magazine is all about, make your own programs, really understand the hardware. And they're like, dude, the 6502 chip, we've been using it for years now. The computers that came out in 77, it's 1980. We need to be moving on. Here's this new chip, and they're trying to give you a guideline of how to insert it into your computers on, what are the new commands to be able to program it in assembly code. And it's like, dude, you're fighting a war that's already over. The computer's moving on. And these fixed hardware platforms that you don't sort of tinker with yourself, but you build to the basic spec, that idea is taking hold. And this just seemed like this weird attempt to turn back the clock and go to this older version of computing, which when we started the show, when we're doing the 78, 79 jumps, were very, very common still. By 1980, these are the only guys talking about something like this. It's pretty much a dead concept, but it was so, the entire shift of the magazine was going to go to 6809 just seemed so funny to me that I needed to talk about it.
Well, at least they're talking about actual hardware, not just some RGB lights. So
that's true.
People.
Yeah, and the 6809, the Vectrex is an amazing machine and stuff, but it's not going to have a future.
Okay. Coming from the future, saying that means something.
Exactly.
All right.
Hindsight's 2020, my friend. Hindsight is 2020. That's the purpose of this show.
Yeah, this is true. Moving on. Avalon Hill's first batch of games gets reviewed.
Venerable strategy game maker Avalon Hill, whose entry into the computer game business we reported on back in our May 1980 jump, has its first batch of games reviewed this month by Creative Computing magazine. The reviewer is less than impressed as the games are little more than ports of existing board games and take no real advantage of the capabilities of home computers. The bright side is, though, that through Avalon Hill's name recognition, hobby shops and more traditional retailers that may never have considered stocking computer games may now take the plunge.
Okay.
Your first question is, who is Avalon Hill?
No. Obviously, it's a venerable strategy game maker. No. I was just thinking that they are coming from the board game section, and they were thinking board games, and I think this is something you see throughout our entire episode today, that there are people that are thinking traditionally. They are utterly failing.
What Odyssey tried to do was a board game, video game hybrid. But here, they're just doing one-to-one translations. And the Avalon Hill games, they very much could use the help of computers because, it's 1,000 little pieces and super complicated rules.
Yeah.
But the problem with it is that doing that on a computer doesn't necessarily make for a good computer game, especially given the limited graphics and the space constraints on the screen and everything else. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is, a couple pages further down the line in the same magazine, they also review SSI's Warp Factor, which was a Star Trek knockoff that gets glowing reviews. And it's also a strategy game in the same mold as a lot of the Avalon Hill games. It's tailored for the computer. It takes the reductions necessary. It streamlines the things and takes advantage of what the computer can do. Yeah. And the idea of just converting one-to-one the board game onto the computer, at this point at least, just isn't a viable option. And Avalon Hill is going to be in the game for a little while longer, but not for very long.
Yeah. You want the computer to do all the thinking for you, and you just want to make the decisions,
Exactly. But at the same time, if you have a game that requires, a giant board with hundreds of slots on the board, different places where you can put stuff, if your computer can't display that much detail, then you got a problem.
Yeah.
And so you have to design around what the computer can and can't do. And that's just not what Avalon Hill was doing. They thought, the power, the strength of their properties would be enough. And unfortunately, it's a different medium.
Unfortunately, okay.
But sticking with software.
Sticking with the software, Soft Talk reviews Ultima, Olympic Decathlon, Cardles and Cutthroats, and Zork.
Cartels.
What did I say? Caudal.
Cardles, yeah. Sounded like cartilage. A real cornucopia of games have been hitting the Apple II. With a growing library of games, Apple's 8-bit is strengthening its reputation as the go-to system for computer gamers. And yes, okay. Some of these reviews are a little bit behind the times, but the fact that you get 4 big, huge titles. Cartels and Cutthroats is Danny Button or Danielle Button-Berry. Zork, which we've talked about in the past, Infocom's first game. Olympic Decathlon is a multi-event sports game released by Microsoft. And Ultima, of course, is the first game in the Ultima series by Lord British. So all 4 of these games in one issue, it's just like, holy crap. And they all get really good reviews. They're all doing things that you've never seen done in games before. And they're really, with the exception of Olympic Decathlon, they're all games that you would never be able to pull off on a console. That's the impressive part here. They're really taking advantage of what computers can do. Yeah.
See, and this is success. This is how we're successful.
Very much so. The Apple II is going to give us a wonderful generation of game programmers. The John Romeros of this world are coming off of these games, off of this experience programming as kids on the Apple II. And it's an extremely important machine for this time in U.S. game development.
Oh, yeah.
It's not going to have that much of an impact any place else. And that's where the Commodore machines are going to really make the breakthrough in places like Germany and Sweden and so forth. But then again, the UK is another story. BBC chooses
Acorn over Sinclair, and thank you for making this transition possible.
You're very welcome. I didn't know if you had anything. I thought I'd save you right there.
Wonderful.
The British Broadcasting Company has chosen the computer that will be the centerpiece of a multi-part series of shows to promote computer education in the UK. None of the existing machines on the market was chosen. Instead, they have gone with an offer from Acorn to build a new system that meets their specs. Your Computer Magazine writes in this month's editorial about how this has upset many in the industry and fears that a non-computer-centric entity such as the BBC may not be the right ones to be making a decision which could determine the fate of computing in the UK. Clive Sinclair has claimed he never had a proper chance to see the specs for the BBC Micro, and Tangerine is also going after the fairness of the procedures. Critics also claim that Acorn won't be able to deliver on time and budget what they have promised. All of this as Margaret Thatcher's government is pushing to have a Micro in every secondary school by the end of the year. Curiously, the ZX81 gets reviewed in the same issue, and the lack of reliability, poor manufacturing quality, and ephemeral nature of the machine get criticized.
You think there was some bribing involved?
No. This is actually a story that's pretty well documented. Everybody pretty much understands it. And there's even a movie about it. There's a movie about it you really should watch called Micromen. They made a movie about this.
The thing that you've mentioned like
1,000 times that you still haven't watched. Yes. It's on YouTube. You can go watch it. It's worth your 90 minutes or 2 hours or however long it is. It really does paint the picture of this world at this time in England. Because England is a little bit behind. Any imports from the States are massively expensive. So the homegrown computer industry is really a world unto itself.
Yeah.
And the fact is, Clive Sinclair's products are unreliable as hell. They're flimsy, they're crappy, they're cheap. But if you're going to put this in a school where kids are going to be pounding away on it, you need something that's sturdy, that's solid, that is going to survive. And, you know, the little chiclet keyboard where every time you press a key, you have to press really hard down on it just to make it work. And the screen flashes every time you do that because it doesn't have enough memory to process the keystroke and the screen at the same time.
Oh, Lord.
Is not going to cut it.
Really?
Yeah. The one thing that they do talk about here in the show is that everybody was expecting the spec to be a Z80 processor and that it was going to be able to use a standard operating system. But the fact is that if you were going to do that with the memory restraints and everything else, it wasn't going to be feasible. And instead, they're going with the guys at Acorn had this demo machine called the Proton, and that is using I believe a 6502 variant chip in it. Okay. And it's going in a very different direction from the Sinclair machines, which are all Z80 processor based. And this BBC machine, it's going to be slightly delayed. It's not going to make it out in time for Christmas. It is going to be showing up in 1982. But the show is also going to be airing in 1982. There's some great moments in the micro-end film where they're literally trying to get the machine running as the show is going out live. So as they're doing the show, these guys are, you know, the camera's looking in one direction and the other direction. The guys are getting the machine up and running. And then when the camera comes back just in the nick of time, they get it running again and stuff. So it was very seat of the pants, but the fact that every school in England ends up with one of these BBC micros or whole labs full of them really kickstarts a lot of people into programming. It really gets a lot of stuff going. Now, it's not going to become the main computer just because of cost, because England is going through some really hard economic times at this point. And Sinclair's ZX Spectrum is going to be the machine that conquers the market. And then later on, the Amstrad CPC, which is also a Z80 processor machine, is going to eat up a lot of market. But Acorn is going to have this educational market, this secure income for a very long time. They're going to have some stumbles. They're going to release some machines that don't do very well. But later on, they're going to try to do a follow-up to the BBC Micro, the Archimedes. They're going to create a RISC CPU for it. That RISC CPU, the Archimedes RISC machine, is later going to be renamed the Acorn RISC machine. And, well, that spawns a little company called ARM, which makes all the RISC processors. Basically, this is what sets the ARM processor into motion.
Okay.
And so while all these magazines are worrying that, there's only going to be the Acorn machines on the market. It's not the government choosing a winner here, but what they are really doing is recognizing Acorn is the more professional company that can actually produce a professional product. And ultimately, that's going to lead to money financing basically the ARM processors we know today start here because that's where the money's coming from. As opposed to Sinclair, who is never really interested in computers. It's sort of a side thing that he's doing, and he's going to blow all of his profits trying to create his little electric buggy contraption. So, yeah, that's... you need to see this thing. It's really, really bad. Really, really bad.
Okay. You know, the interesting thing is that those guys rely on the 6502 processor or something alike. And today we talked about that thing being outdated, and
that's exactly it. I mean, but this is why the Intel x86 architecture is still with us today. the backward compatibility. If you have these legions of programmers who have now learned assembly code on the Apple II with 6502, well, guess what? We're going to see some of the biggest stars of the Apple II scene go to the NES. We're going to see some of these guys, transfer from one 6502-based machine to the next with no problems because they know the code. Mm-hmm. And once you know how these systems work, you can iterate on the chip and still be a relevant factor in the market. Whereas if you have to constantly learn a new assembly code, you're going to be running into some headaches. You're going to be losing a lot of people whose knowledge or who can't update their knowledge or whose knowledge is no longer relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's just one of those things. Now, granted, we're going to get a lot of Z80 programmers, and the BBC Micro is going to give us some amazing games like Elite is born on the BBC Micro. So,
okay.
And trust me, once we get to Elite coming out, that's going to be a 7 minutes in heaven. That's going to be a brilliant 7 minutes in heaven. I see it already. It's going to be a rerun of Dragon's Lair. Just you trying to dock the ship. That's going to be hilarious.
Okay.
Sorry. It's not. You'll get it. You'll figure it out just in time for the 7 minutes to be up. I'm sure of it. Or something. Maybe. We'll see. It'll be funny, no matter what.
Okay. Well,
okay. Everybody who's ever played Elite is laughing right now or giggling, and everybody else is just like, "What the hell is he talking about?" Okay.
I'm belonging to the "What the hell is he talking about" section.
I know, that's the best part. Okay. Believe that's the end of our time trip back to June of 1981.
Not bad.
No, not shabby. So what's the word for the episode?
The word for the episode is... I don't know. I want to do something with false predictions and the not working mixture of board games, electronics, and computer games.
How about it's not one word, but declared dead.
Wonderful. So we don't have companies going broke, but we have a lot of stuff being declared dead. I love it.
Exactly. Okay, so that's where we are. Remember, everybody, follow us on the socials. And again, check out the links to some of the podcasts that we enjoy, always down in the show notes. And trying to think, join us on Patreon. Lots of good interviews to be enjoyed there, as well as, of course, the video version of the 7 Minutes in Heaven is also visible there, so you can see how well Peter did playing Zork, which we still haven't recorded, but I'm sure it's going to be absolutely awesome. And any final words, Peter?
No, that's basically it. I mean, I'm looking forward to playing Zork.
You'll have a great time. I'm sure of it.
Okay. Well, then, I would say, guys, don't do anything that we wouldn't do, which leaves you not a whole lot of options. Because
it leaves them a lot of options. Trust me. There's that one thing with the sheep and the whipped cream. But other than that,
you forgot. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that was weird. Anyhow, and otherwise, I'd say have fun.
Exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Exactly. Yeah, I was so looking forward to that. Usually you say that, and I just went in there. But you had your sheep, your midget, and your whipped cream. Wonderful.
There you go.
Bye.
Bye.